In 1974, a man named Derek Hollis read gas meters for a living in Coventry. He walked 17 miles every working day, entering back gardens through side gates, crouching beside kitchen doors to read the dial, and writing the number in his book with a stub of pencil. He knew which households had a dog, which had an awkward gate latch, and which customers would offer him a cup of tea. He had done it for 11 years and expected to do it for 11 more. By 1985 he was gone, replaced by a digital meter that read itself and sent the number down a wire. Number 14 on this list disappeared from European streets even faster than Derek did, replaced so completely that most people under 40 have no memory that the job ever existed. Number 7 vanished almost overnight when a single piece of technology arrived, taking with it an entire human layer of knowledge, personality, and community connection that the technology has never been able to replace. And number 1, the job at the very top of this list, was held by more people in Britain, France, and Germany in 1970 than work in the entire European automotive industry today, and it disappeared so gradually and so quietly that nobody organized a single farewell. These are 20 jobs that existed in Europe in the 1970s that have completely disappeared, not outsourced, not relocated, but gone from the face of the working world entirely, replaced by machines, by systems, by software, or simply by the collapse of the need they once served. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what these jobs tell us about the human layer that once existed between people and the services they depended on is something the modern world replaced without ever quite understanding what it was replacing. Let us count them down. Number 20, the gas meter reader. Derek Hollis and his counterparts across Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands walked the residential streets of their assigned districts every 6 to 8 weeks, entering properties, locating the meter in whatever cupboard, cellar, or outbuilding it had been installed in, and reading the dial with a practiced eye. The job required the most basic literacy, a reasonable level of physical fitness, and the social intelligence to manage 100 different kinds of doorstep encounter per day without giving offense or taking it. A gas meter reader employed by British Gas in the early 1970s earned between £35 and £45 per week, which was slightly below the average industrial wage but came with a company uniform, a pension, and the genuine pleasure of working entirely outdoors in all weathers. When digital meters and then smart meters made remote reading possible through the 1980s and 1990s, the job evaporated district by district as the technology rolled out. Number 19, the telephone operator. In every European city in the 1970s, a switchboard of women in headsets sat at a plug-in socket board connecting calls that could not be dialed directly. They connected you to the speaking clock, to directory inquiries, to the international exchange, to the emergency services when your fingers were shaking too hard to dial correctly. They were the human nervous system of the telephone network, trained to be calm, clear, and efficient in every circumstance. A telephone operator working for the GPO in Britain in the early 1970s or for Deutsche Bundespost in Germany earned between £28 and £38 per week in equivalent terms, worked shifts that covered the full 24 hours, and provided a service that was genuinely personal in ways that automated systems have never managed to replicate. The introduction of direct dialing, electronic exchanges, and eventually digital switching made the connection function automatic, and the operator's numbers fell year by year through the 1970s and 1980s until the last manual exchanges closed. Number 18, the cinema projectionist. Before the multiplex and the digital projector, every cinema in Europe employed at least one projectionist, and larger cinemas employed 2 or 3 to cover continuous showings across multiple screens. The projectionist worked in a small, hot, noisy booth behind the auditorium, managing heavy reels of celluloid film, threading the projector with practiced hands, monitoring the gate for dust and scratches, and changing reels at the precise moment marked by the small circle in the top right corner of the frame. The job required a certificate of competence, an understanding of the mechanical and optical systems of the projector, and the physical skill to change a reel in under 12 seconds without losing the audience. A cinema projectionist in Britain in the early 1970s earned between £30 and £40 per week, worked evenings and weekends, and was the invisible guardian of the experience that millions of Europeans regarded as their primary weekly entertainment. When digital projection arrived in the late 1990s and through the 2000s, the projectionist's technical skills became irrelevant almost overnight. Number 17, the bank clerk. The bank clerk who sat behind the counter of every branch bank in Europe in the 1970s was not the casual retail bank employee of today. He or she was a trained professional who could process a check by hand, reconcile a ledger, calculate interest without a calculator, and manage the cash drawer to the penny at the end of every working day. The bank clerk was the human face of a financial system that had no ATMs, no internet banking, and no automated clearing. Every transaction passed through a human being who checked it, recorded it, and filed it. A bank clerk in Britain, in the early 1970s, earned between £25 and £35 per week, with a career progression that led to branch manager status, a position of genuine local authority and community standing. The introduction of ATMs in the late 1970s, computer-based clearing through the 1980s, and internet banking in the 1990s reduced the demand for counter staff progressively until the branch clerk became an almost vestigial presence in a digital system. Number 16. The typesetter and compositor. Every newspaper, every book, every printed advertisement in Europe in the 1970s passed through the hands of a typesetter or compositor who assembled the words into the physical form that would be printed. In the hot metal tradition, the compositor worked with linotype or monotype machines that cast individual lines or characters in lead alloy, assembling them into pages that were then used to make the printing plates. A compositor, working on a national newspaper in Britain in the early 1970s, unionized and protected by the powerful print unions, could earn between £80 and £120 per week, making them among the highest-paid skilled manual workers in the country. When desktop publishing arrived in the 1980s and the print unions were broken in the disputes of 1983 to 1986, the entire trade evaporated within a decade. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting, because the jobs described so far were primarily replaced by technology. But the next entries describe a different kind of disappearance, jobs that vanished not because a machine could do them better, but because the social fabric that made them necessary quietly unraveled. The neighborhoods changed, the habits shifted, and one morning the need was simply no longer there. Number 15. The rent collector. Every council estate and every private landlord's portfolio in Britain, France, and Germany in the 1970s had a rent collector, a person who visited each property on a regular schedule, accepted cash or a check, issued a receipt, noted repairs required, and maintained the human connection between the landlord and the tenant that kept both parties accountable. A rent collector employed by a local authority housing department in Britain in the early 1970s earned between £28 and £38 per week and was, in many council estates, the most regular and trusted official contact that tenants had. When housing benefit was paid directly to landlords through the benefit system, when direct debit replaced the weekly cash payment, and when housing management was centralized away from the estates themselves, the rent collector disappeared. Number 14. The TV license detector van operator. From the 1960s through to the early 2000s, the BBC and its continental equivalents maintained a fleet of vans equipped with directional aerials that could detect the oscillation frequency produced by a television receiver, identifying households that possessed a television but had not purchased a license. The operators who drove these vans and managed the detection equipment were public employees with a specific technical knowledge and a legal authority to pursue evaders that made the job genuinely unusual in the landscape of working life. The introduction of digital television and eventually the reform of the license fee system made the detector van redundant, and the small army of operators who had staffed them retired or moved to other work without their profession being much mourned. Number 13. The pools collector and football coupon agent. For many thousands of people in Britain and across Northern Europe, collecting football pools coupons was not a supplement to another income, but the primary job itself. A senior pools collector employed by Littlewoods or Vernons in the 1970s, who managed a large urban territory, could earn between £40 and £60 per week in commission, managing a team of sub-collectors and maintaining a customer base of several thousand households. When the National Lottery arrived in 1994, Littlewoods Pools alone shed 50,000 jobs within 2 years. Number 12. The coalman. The coalman, employed by a coal merchant and delivering on a regular domestic round, was a fixture of working-class and suburban life across Britain and Northern Europe until the 1980s. He drove a lorry, knew his customers by name, carried hundredweight sacks up paths and stairs in all weathers, and earned between £30 and £45 per week in the early 1970s for work that was among the most physically demanding of any regular domestic service job. When North Sea Gas Central Heating replaced coal fires through the 1970s and 1980s, the coalman's round contracted year by year until the last domestic coal delivery businesses closed in the early 1990s. Number 11. The insurance agent on the doorstep collection round. The man from the Pearl, from the Prudential, or the Royal London, who came to your door every week or every fortnight to collect the small premium payments on the industrial life insurance policies that working-class families had maintained for generations, was one of the most regular visitors to the working-class streets of Britain and continental Europe. He carried a collection book, noted each payment, and maintained a personal relationship with several hundred families that lasted for years or decades. A prudential agent managing a productive collection round in the early 1970s could earn between £35 and £55 per week in commission, with additional earnings from new policy sales to existing customers. When direct debit replaced doorstep collection through the 1980s and 1990s, the entire collection agent network dismantled itself within a generation. Second pattern break. This next one is where the math gets fascinating. Because the next entries describe jobs that disappeared not because of technology or changing social habits, but simply because the economic model that made them viable ceased to exist, leaving people with skills that the new economy had no use for and no interest in retraining. Number 10. The shorthand typist and audio typist. Before word processors, before personal computers, before dictation software, every office in Britain, France, and Germany employed shorthand typists who could take dictation at speeds of 80 to 120 words per minute in a specialized notation system and transcribe it accurately onto paper using a manual and then an electric typewriter. A shorthand typist in a London professional office in the early 1970s earned between £22 and £32 per week for a skill that had required 1 to 2 years of dedicated training to acquire and that could not be replicated by anyone who had not specifically learned it. When the word processor arrived in the early 1980s and senior staff began typing their own correspondence, the shorthand typist's role collapsed with extraordinary speed across the entire European office economy. Number 9. The telegram delivery boy. Until well into the 1970s, the telegram remained the fastest way to deliver a written message over distance, and the boy who collected the message from the post office and delivered it by bicycle to the recipient's address was a familiar figure in both urban and rural European life. Telegrams carried urgent news of births and deaths and business emergencies, and their arrival was itself a signal that something significant had occurred. The telegram delivery boy in Britain, in the early 1970s, earned between £8 and £12 per week for work that was physically demanding and emotionally significant in ways that far exceeded what the wage implied. When the telephone became universal in European homes through the 1970s and fax machines began to handle urgent document transmission in the 1980s, the telegram fell into disuse and the delivery job with it. Number 8. The library van driver and traveling librarian. Before the internet and before cheap paperback books were available in every supermarket, the mobile library van that visited rural communities and housing estates where no fixed library existed was the primary source of books and reading material for millions of Europeans. The driver, who also served as librarian, knew the reading preferences of every regular borrower on his route, remembered what they had enjoyed before, and made recommendations with the authority of long personal familiarity. A mobile library driver employed by a county council in Britain in the early 1970s earned between £25 and £35 per week and provided a genuinely irreplaceable service to communities that had no other access to the cultural resources a library represented. When local authority budget cuts through the 1980s and 1990s contracted library services, and when the internet eventually made much of what a library offered available from home, the mobile library network contracted to almost nothing. Number 7. The telephone box cleaner and maintenance operative. In every town and village across Europe in the 1970s, the red British telephone box, the French cabine téléphonique, and the German Telefonzelle required a human being to visit it regularly to clean it, repair minor damage, ensure the directories were intact, and report more serious faults to the engineering department. A GPO maintenance operative, responsible for a circuit of telephone boxes in a provincial British town in the early 1970s, earned between £28 and £38 per week and was, for many isolated rural residents, the only regular official visitor their community received. When the mobile phone made the public telephone box redundant through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the maintenance operatives who had served them quietly retired and were not replaced. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes personal. Because the final entries on this list are not about the individual jobs, but about what their collective disappearance meant for the texture of daily life in European communities, for the human connections that were embedded in the simple act of one person serving another in a regular and predictable way. Number 6. The milkman. We have described the milkman's business economics before, but what we have not fully described is what he was beyond an income. He was the man who noticed when the bottles were not taken in. He was the person who knew, because he visited every day before the rest of the street was awake, which households were struggling. He was the only daily contact that many elderly people living alone would have. When supermarkets drove down milk prices to the point where the doorstep round could no longer be economic, they eliminated a service that had provided not just milk, but human surveillance and community connection that has never been replaced. Number 5. The television repairman. Every high street in Europe in the 1970s had a television repair shop whose proprietor could diagnose a fault in a valve or a transistor television, order the required part, and return the set to working order at a cost that was a fraction of replacement. When television sets began to be made cheaply enough that repair was more expensive than replacement, and when the technical complexity of modern sets outpaced the capability of the independent repair shop, the television repairman closed his premises, and the knowledge he had accumulated over 20 years became valueless overnight. Number 4. The bus conductor. On every double-decker bus in Britain and every tram in the cities of continental Europe in the 1970s, a second crew member stood in the aisle or on the platform, issued tickets, made change, knew the route and all its connections, helped elderly passengers on and off, and managed the behavior of the vehicle's passengers with a combination of authority and good humor. The bus conductor earned between £25 and £35 per week for work that was physically demanding and socially complex, and whose elimination in favor of driver-only operation reduced the quality of public transport in ways that are still felt by the passengers who remember the difference. Number 3. The GPO engineer and telephone exchange operator. The men and women who maintained the physical infrastructure of the European telephone network in the 1970s, who climbed telegraph poles in all weathers, who managed the electromechanical exchanges that connected every call, and who visited homes to install and repair telephone equipment, represented a skilled technical workforce whose expertise was specific to a technology that the digital revolution made obsolete within a single decade. A GPO telephone engineer in Britain in the early 1970s earned between £35 and £50 per week and could expect a secure career in an essential infrastructure role. When digital switching made electromechanical expertise redundant, and when privatisation restructured the employment base of the former state telephone companies, the engineer's specific skill set had no market. Number 2. The factory worker in a British or European manufacturing plant. In 1970, 1 in 3 working people in Britain worked in manufacturing. By 2000, it was 1 in 6. By 2020, it was fewer than 1 in 10. The factory worker who assembled components, operated a lathe, worked a press, or managed a production line in the industrial heartlands of Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium in the 1970s was not performing unskilled work. They were carrying specific knowledge of specific machines and specific processes, embedded in specific communities that had been built around specific industries, and when those industries went, the knowledge went with them, and the communities went too. Number 1. The community itself as an economic unit. At the very top of this list sits not a job, but the entire human infrastructure that surrounded every job on this list and that gave those jobs their meaning. The rent collector knew which family was behind on their payments because they were struggling. The insurance agent knew which family had just had a baby because he had sold them a policy for it. The milkman knew which household had not taken in their bottles. The gas meter reader knew which houses were cold in winter. The bus conductor knew which regular passengers were looking unusually tired. These were not surveillance functions. They were the natural consequence of regular human contact embedded in the delivery of ordinary services, and when the services were automated and the human contact was eliminated, the community lost its daily mechanism for noticing and responding to the needs of its members. What replaced them was a system of formal welfare referrals, emergency service callouts, and digital monitoring that costs 10 times as much and delivers a fraction of the human warmth. These 20 disappeared jobs were not simply sources of income for the people who held them. They were the connective tissue of a working society, the human layer that existed between the institutions and the people those institutions were supposed to serve. The next time an automated voice tells you your call is important and asks you to press 1 for billing, you are experiencing the absence of what this list describes. Try to remember what it felt like when a person answered. Your parents and grandparents remember. They knew. Now you know too.